Okay, now before I move further ahead, now let us go back in time and let us see what were the original functions of cerebellum. So as you can see here, three of the primary functions of cerebellum is displayed here: the balance and equilibrium, the coordination, and the planning and timing of sequential movement. So we were currently discussing coordination, and before that we have already discussed balance and equilibrium. So naturally the next would be the planning and timing of sequential movement. So we continue with the function of coordination before moving on to the next function. And here we are going to understand that all of the motor movements that we perform are pendular in nature because of the virtue of inertia. For example, you try to raise your arm, because it has set a motion, it tends to overshoot beyond its trajectory than what was intended by the virtue of inertia. Okay, so remember this point, that all the movements are pendular and we try to maintain a balance to prevent overshooting through cerebellum. So what we see in this scenario is a person trying to lift a glass. But as a person tries to reach for the glass and lift it, because of the inherent pendular moment that is set the moment he lifts the glass and the virtue of inertia, he overshoots the trajectory and the glass is flipped upwards. It is not being taken up slowly, planned, but instead it is going upwards. And when he tries to correct the moment by getting it back to where he actually intended, it becomes another motion which is pendular and he flips downwards instead of getting it back to the desired place. And this sort of movement keeps going on, which is pendular, which keeps overshooting, and it is not precise because of the lack of cerebellum. And that is why whenever there is a damage to cerebellum, any movement that you perform tends to have some sort of jerky pendular movement, and you are not able to precisely lift an object, move your arm, raise your arm, or any other motor task you perform. There is constant interruption of inertia and the pendular movements that sets in the moment we try to start a task. Okay, so this involuntary movement of the muscle that is involved while you make a movement, which is seen only whenever you try to perform a task, is seen in cases whenever there is a damage to cerebellum, and this type of involuntary movement is called as tremor. And since this tremor is happening only whenever you perform a task, it is also called as intentional tremor. Whenever you intend to do a task, you tend to overshoot from its original plan of movement. And when you do that, repeatedly you try to correct it, and this becomes a jerky, shaking, involuntary type of movement, which is called as intentional tremor. So cerebellum is not only preventing these kind of movements from happening, it also helps us perform fine, precise movement, which is also called as ballistic movements. To give examples of ballistic movements, you can think of clicking, you can think of playing a keyboard, you can think of playing an instrument, you can think of driving a car, you can think of performing complex motor activities which involves fine precision, any other example that you can think of. All of this is only achieved because of the constant inputs from cerebellum. So let us see how it is preventing an overshoot. Okay, not only it is giving an excitatory impulse, but it also preventing the overshoot from happening, which results in successive sequential smooth movements that help us to perform not only the day-to-day activities, but also to learn or to remember a complex motor movement that would eventually become your passion. So this kind of ballistic movement, which I have just named, is only possible when cerebellum initially sends out a signal which is excitatory in output and followed by sending a negative stimulus which prevents the overshoot from happening, and these two together stimuli, which are timed differently, helps us to perform pre-planned rapid ballistic movements. So once again, to quickly revise, cerebellum sends out an initial excitatory stimulus which gives out the motor output of performing a task, for example typing. First you send out an excitatory stimulus to the arm, to the fingers, and then you start clicking on the keyboard. But to prevent overshoot, to prevent exaggeration or the tremors from happening, the cerebellum immediately sends out a delayed negative response which prevents the initial movement that was sent in the form of excitatory stimulus to overshoot. And these sort of movements can also be seen when you move your eyes from one plane to another and you try to fix it on one object whenever you are in a moving plane. This happens when you are in a vehicle and you try to look at an object. You are fixating your gaze in the form of constant movements of the extraocular muscles that helps you fixate on an object even whenever there is a motion. And this is possible only because of cerebellum, which not only helps in the ballistic movements but also in the sort of movements that is performed by the extraocular muscles. These movements are called as saccadic movements, and these are the rapid, rhythmic, alternating movements of eyes that helps it fixate from one object to another or to fixate on one constant object whenever you are on a moving plane. Now that we have finally finished the second function of cerebellum, that is the coordination, we can finally move on to the last function, that is the planning and timing of sequential motor movement. So to understand this clearly, try to remember from the last video that there is a constant connection between cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. Which part of cerebral cortex? It is the motor cortex. So now what actually happens is, cerebral cortex, it creates the plan for the movement. Okay. So for the movement to be initiated, there is another structure called the basal ganglia, which helps in the initiation of the movement. Okay. And before the movement could be relayed further to perform the task of rapid sequential movement, this is sent back to the cerebellum. Which part of cerebellum? It is called the lateral zone of cerebellar hemisphere. This we will study in the next video, where we can discuss on the functional anatomy of the cerebellum. So there is a constant communication between the motor cortex and the cerebellum, and now this constant communication helps in creating the sequence of movement for the plan that was created by cerebral cortex. To explain this better, whenever we make an animation, we use series of layers and frameworks to create a moving picture that ultimately looks like this. But to explain with terms of real life scenarios where the sequence of movement helps us to perform tasks, let us take this example. When you run a marathon, you run along a curved line where you have to plan continuously the next sequence of movement that would prevent you from going straight. Instead of that, you make a curved turn. And this is only possible because of cerebellum. So the plan of running along the curved track is given by the cerebral cortex, which we all already know by now. And now what next happens is, the sequence of movement which is supposed to be created by the cerebellum is stored in the lateral zone of cerebellar hemisphere. This is a sequence of movement which helps the person go along the curved task, and it is already created inside the cerebellum before the movement has occurred. Okay, so the sequence of images, like we have seen, the transition of one image to another led to a framework of different images creating an animation. Same way, the different set of motion, one screenshot at a time, which was taken by the cerebellum, which was predicted and stored in the lateral zone of cerebellar hemisphere, is now ready with the cerebellum. This stored information will be sent continuously before the task has occurred, and that helps the person to run along the marathon smoothly, efficiently, without the constant inputs from the cerebral cortex. The cerebellum has taken over, and it's constantly sending the sequence of movement which it's already synthesized, stored, and now it is giving the motor outputs to the muscles of the legs and help the person to run along the curved task without any interruption. And this mechanism is also called as servo mechanism, which is nothing but a feed forward type of mechanism, which means nothing but the type of response which was generated by an object without the stimulus. With this, we finally finished the last function of cerebellum, that is to plan and time the sequence of movements. This is very important part of the function of cerebellum that, along with the other functions, help us coordinate, plan, and also maintain the balance of all the movements whenever we try to perform a task. So having learned all of the functions meticulously performed by cerebellum, there is one last aspect of the functions that we can discuss. So in this we can see the lateral zones of the cerebellum was destroyed in this experimental animal, and then what happens is, when the monkey tried to walk on a straight line, so instead of averting the wall which was in front of the monkey, instead of taking a turn, it ended up colliding with the wall. So with this, what was concluded that whenever there is a damage to the lateral hemispheres of the cerebellum, the prediction part of the function of cerebellum was destroyed. So to explain the function of prediction by the cerebellum, you can also think of the sequence of movement that was generated in the cerebellum. This is only possible because cerebellum has the ability, from the visual inputs that it constantly receives, from the vestibular apparatus, the state of plane that it constantly receives, and the length, tension, positioning of the muscle that it constantly receives. All of this information is integrated in the cerebellum, and it predicts the next sort of movement. For example, if you are at a distance from a wall and when you are about to reach the wall, it sends a signals for your muscles to stop before you hit the wall. Okay, it has predicted the length of the collision and length at which you need to stop, and this gives us the unique ability of timing, predicting, and planning the moment without detrimental consequences. With this, we finally conclude the functions of cerebellum. I hope that this was helpful for you to now understand the complex terminologies and the complex mechanisms behind the functioning of cerebellum. And this would help you to understand the functional anatomy of cerebellum even better. So that's it for today. Leave a feedback in the comment section. And if you have any doubts or queries, or if you want to directly contact me, I've given my email address in the description box. So happy learning and see you in the next video.